Hi, welcome back to my ESG exam channel. All of E, S, and G, we've already visited E, environment, S, social, and then right now, we're going to visit G, that is governance. But then again, before entering to the new chapter, could we have a look at the key issues that we came across in the last chapter and see how much of those that you can remember. Again, if you have difficulty remembering many of these items that you visited last time, then I suggest you go back to the last chapter and revise before continuing. So if you're ready, let's begin. Here are the learning outcomes of chapter 5. This chapter is relatively short, well, say compare with say chapter 3. But then there is a lot of examinable material in this chapter, so we still need to pay a lot of attention to the content and the details. The first learning outcome is pretty much a background about corporate governance. So the background is that, well, there have been a lot of company scandals or even failures which have led to the establishment of corporate governance rules, especially UK. For example, say UK, there were a number of scandals or even failures, such as say Caparo, Polypack, Maxwell Shock Mill Group, so BCCI Bank. They've led to capital report, and as a consequence of that capital report, the UK Corporate Governance Code. Capital report, well, as you can imagine, well, this kind of related to the chocolate company because, well, the report was responsible by the chairman of the chocolate company at that time. And apart from capital report, there was also a Greenberg report, which was as a result of pay levels of newly privatized utilities. This report has increased the visibility of remuneration structures and pressed towards transparency over corporate KPIs, or so-called key performance indicators. And in the EU, there were scandals of Ahold and Parmalat. In the US, you may have heard of Enron, Tyco, and WorldCom. And these failures have led to Sarbanes-Oxley Act, also called Sarbox. And the financial crisis in 2008 has led to the Dodd-Frank Act. And apart from these, there are also, well, other scandals like Satya in India, Olympus in Japan, Volkswagen, and Wirecard. So what is actually corporate governance? It is actually a process and structure of overseeing the business and management of a company. And key issues to be considered include shareholders' rights, the likelihood of success of the company strategy and effectiveness of its delivery, executive pay, audit practices, board independence and expertise, transparency or accountability. And there are issues like the related party transactions and dual class share structures. And there may be issues with transparency or other things that, well, these two things will may have negative impact on corporate governance. And we can identify two A's in corporate governance, that is accountability and alignment. In terms of accountability, the senior executives need to be accountable to non-executive directors, and in turn, non-executive directors, they can be considered as representatives of shareholders, especially minority shareholders. So these non-executive directors have to be accountable to these people. And in order to ensure accountability of the board, we seek diversified skill sets of directors to facilitate meaningful discussions and debates. And in terms of the board chairman, it is desirable for the board chairman to be a non-executive director, and it is thus desirable for the position of chairman and CEO to be held by separate people. And for alignment, is the alignment of interest between, for example, the company's executives and shareholders. And here, there's the issue of agency problem, which is a consequence of the separation of ownership, i.e. the shareholders, and control, that is the company executives. And with engagement, which is the active dialogue between companies and investors, that will help alignment between the board and investors. And we also see alignment between majority and minority shareholders. See, there are a few ways. For example, it is quite common if there are major transactions by listed companies, depending on size, the stock exchange may demand additional disclosures, and for those really large ones, they may require explicit shareholder approval or votes. The other one is so-called preemptive rights. That is, when a company issues new shares, existing shareholders must be given the right to subscribe those shares. And lastly, the dual class shares. That is, there are two different types of shares, and one class gives more voting rights to the owners, and this is typical for tech companies, where a lot of these shares are owned by the founders, and therefore they'll continue to have more voting rights than other public shareholders. And this kind of arrangement may well disadvantage minority shareholders, as they have less voting rights than the founders. Right, this slide is important. We need to remember, in a typical board, there are three committees. The first one is the Nominations Committee, which is also called Corporate Governance Committee. This committee evaluates potential candidates for senior management and board membership, and it's pretty much to identify the right candidate for senior managers and board members. And by doing so, the committee ensures that the board overall is balanced and effective, and management is accountable. The second is Audit Committee, and obviously is responsible for audit matters. The committee oversees financial reporting and audit, including internal audit. Well, even though external auditors perform the audit role, but then, well, at the board level, it is the audit committee which is finally responsible. And unless there's a separate risk committee, which is usual for, say, banks and insurance companies, the audit committee is all in charge of risk oversight. In terms of frequency of meetings, the capital report has suggested twice a year, but then right now it's more common for audit committees to be called 3 or 4 times a year. But the last one is the Remuneration Committee or Compensation Committee. So obviously, it's a committee that determines executive pay to ensure proper alignment of interests, like, say, the interest between executives and the interest of shareholders. Right, second learning outcome. is to assess several key characteristics of effective corporate governance. Right, so let's start with the UK's Corporate Governance Code, which is the first formal one in the world. And within this code, there are three main themes: board leadership and company purpose, division of responsibilities, composition, succession and evaluation, audit risk and internal control, and also remuneration. And for the three key committees, the audit and remuneration committees will be populated solely by independent non-executive directors. And for the nomination committee, although it need not be populated entirely by these independent non-executive directors, these directors should also form the majority. Right, board structure, diversity, effectiveness, and independence. So this point is made to ensure that the board functions effectively. So ideally, board membership should have a right mix of people with diversified and relevant skills, and there's a right board structure or culture to allow board members to contribute effectively. Say the non-executive board members should have a right to speak out and challenge the executives. And in terms of skill set, things like regular training for board members and board appraisals can help in achieving the aim that board members have the right skills. Last, independence. The ICGN, that is International Corporate Governance Network, has issued global governance principles, and these principles have set out extensive criteria for independence. And within these principles, tenure of board membership may also be limited in order for the independent board members to remain regarded as independent. So here's a list of criteria. Maybe you don't need to remember all of these, but then there are a few obvious criteria, such as say if a board member is related to company senior executives or related to the major shareholders, then this board member will be considered independent enough. And lastly, about the tenure, that means that if a director has been on the board for a long period of time, so even though he is an independent director, in practice, since he or she has been on the board for a very long time, according to ICGN, his or her independence may also be considered compromised. Executive remuneration performance measures and KPI. The aim for a table pay structure is to align the interests of executives and also company's performance. So they include pretty much two parts. One part, fixed salary and benefits, including pension. They may not be directly related to company performance, but then there are two others. Say annual bonus. This linked to short-term performance, maybe say annual performance or achievement KPIs. And these KPIs can be partly non-financial, such as ESG targets. And in terms of longer-term performance, like over a 3-year period, that's normally adjusted by sharing incentives, and then these shares or share options will normally be vested over a long period of time. Reporting and transparency. Firstly, the board should present a fair, balanced, and understandable assessment of the company's position and prospects. One thing of attention is that a lot of companies, they may use so-called alternative performance metrics APMs, that is publishing adjusted or underlying financials, partly to mask weak performance. Since these APMs may create misleading information, the ESMA, European Securities and Markets Authority, has public guidelines on using those, and the ISB, or International Accounting Standards Board, has all published an exposure draft to guide the use of APMs. Another area that's of concern, in particular as this course is a ESG course, is on climate-related disclosures. Right now there are no global consistency standards, but then the UK and New Zealand have already demanded large public companies to report according to TCFD standards. So, for TCFD we met at the beginning of this course, so I hope you still remember what TCFD is. Apart from TCFD, the ISSB, International Sustainability Standards Board, will also develop global sustainability disclosure standards. Some companies may also engage in audit on ESG reporting. That's what currently voluntary and may be done by the so-called normal audit firms or other specialist environmental audit organizations. But then right now there's no universally accepted regulatory standards as to how ESG audit has to be done. Financial integrity and capital allocation. There are two aspects of this topic. One is how capital is to be kept by the company for investment, and how much of that should be distributed to shareholders. And the other is when capital is retained for investment, how that capital is to be distributed across different business activities. And this also includes determining the appropriate level between debt and equity in terms of a company's funding structure and the issuance shares. You may argue that a company which has too little debt is not employing its capital in the best way, but then a company which is too heavily indebted will be vulnerable for a economic or industry downturn. And finally, a related issue is how much of the profit is returned to shareholders via dividends or share buybacks. So they may include things like discussion of payout ratio. Business ethics. Of course, companies will need to obey law, but then investors will well expect companies to behave responsibly beyond obedience of law. And countries like US with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and in the UK the so-called Bribery Act, have extraterritorial effect against corruption. That is, the US and UK can act if their companies, individuals, have been suspected of committing bribery or corruption outside the US and UK. And finally, companies with robust ethical approach will also have robust whistleblowing procedures overseen by audit or risk committee. Now come number 3. This part is assess and contrast different types of corporate governance structures in the world. There are a lot of countries that have been discussed, so maybe here I'll give some general observations. In terms of board of directors, in most countries that is single tier. But then a few countries, like say Germany, Netherlands, Scandinavia, China, they have two-tier boards. That is, there's a management board and a supervisory board. But then we need to be careful that even with a two-tier board system, it doesn't mean better governance. In particular, if minority shareholders have limited influence on the management board, and supervisory boards are not necessarily independent. Like in Germany, it's still quite common for supervisory boards to be headed by former company executives. And the second point is, if you still remember, in the UK's corporate governance code, having board chairman and CEO to be the same person is discouraged. But then this still happens quite often in the US and UK and France. In Australia, very often the only board member who is an executive director is a CEO, and then even though the CEO is a board member, he or she is not subject to re-election by shareholders. And in Japan, the role of non-executive directors is still very small, so most board members are still executive directors. And the US is quite peculiar in the sense that because in the US, company laws are all at the state level, so there's no formal nationwide corporate governance codes, although there are kind of say self-regulatory rules or guidance that to some extent act as a de facto corporate governance code. In terms of enforcement, most countries will adopt a so-called comply or explain approach. That is, well, if you don't comply fully with the codes, then you need to explain. But then in Australia and Netherlands, there's a lot stricter. That is, well, if you do not comply, no, you don't have an option not to comply, and you have to comply and not explain how you comply with the code. And this kind of stricter enforcement may be considered a more advanced form of enforcement. Globally, there are two principles that consider corporate governance best practices. One set is from the ICGN, which we met a few slides earlier, International Corporate Governance Network. And the other set of principles are from OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Right, for other countries, for Germany, we've just seen that the country has got management and supervisory boards. And for the supervisory board, half of that represents shareholders, and half of that is appointed from representatives of the employees. And notably, the supervisory board is accountable to shareholders, but the management board is not accountable to shareholders. And as we've just seen, the chairman of the supervisory board is often a former executive. So, to a certain extent, one may say that the independence of the supervisory board can be somewhat compromised. In Italy, because ownership is often concentrated, so a designated proportion of the board is reserved for minority shareholders. And in Italy, and also in Japan, there's a role called statutory auditor who has certain responsibilities. Like say in Italy to affirm the legality of board actions, and then in Japan, the statutory auditor or supervisor is responsible for monitoring board members' behavior and ensure accuracy of accounts in addition to external audit firm. So this so-called statutory auditor in Italy and Japan is not the same as the external auditor that we normally come across. In Japan, even though companies are now required to have independent directors, but then the hurdle is actually very low. Only 2 is required, and cross-shareholdings between large groups are still very common. UK is meant to be the most advanced because corporate governance code is the first in the world, and within this code, it discourages combined chair and CEO role, and expects chair to be independent. And most of board members should be composed of independent non-executive directors. And the board is responsible for audit and risk issues. In the UK, there are detailed expectations around pay, and remuneration should be linked to performance, and the scope of payments in case of company failure should be limited. And there's one requirement which may be kind of onerous to board members in the UK, is that the board should establish the company's purpose, value and strategy, and satisfy itself that these and its culture are aligned. And if the board is not satisfied, then the board should seek assurance that management has taken corrective action to make sure that these are aligned. And there's an emphasis on workforce, and the workforce may be represented by a director from workforce, a former workforce advisory panel, or a dedicated liaison or non-executive director. And in the UK, the last approach is at present the most common. In the US, as we have highlighted a bit earlier, it is the only major country in the world without a single corporate governance code, because company regulation is the power of individual states. So by definition, there's no such code at the federal level. But then there are so-called best practices recommended by the Common Sense Corporate Governance Principles and the Investor Stewardship Group's Corporate Governance Principles. And in a way, these 2 principles can be regarded as a kind of a proxy for a nationwide corporate governance code. We met Sarbanes or Sarbanes-Oxley Act earlier, and it was created after the major corporate scandals like Enron. Sarbanes has established the PCOB, Public Company Account Oversight Board, as the USA's account audit standard setter and inspector. And among others, Sarbanes has set requirements for the independence and skills of members of the audit committees of companies listed in the US. Dodd-Frank Act was created after the financial crisis in 2008, and it tightened standards for an oversight of banks. It also says that the resolution to consider executive companies' remuneration has to be put to a shareholders' vote every 3 years. And it has also created access to proxy. That is, shareholders who fulfill a certain criteria may add a candidate to the company's formal proxy statement. For example, a candidate for, say, board membership. Okay, learning outcome number 4. It's an audit. So the role of auditor, we probably all know that, is to provide independent review of financial reports prepared by management. And some of you may also note that the auditors may say they're providing assurance services. So auditors provide some assurance that the financial reports fairly represent the performance and position of the business. And you may come across the term called true and fair view. But then remember that audits provide some assurance, but then because audit is a sampling process, it is not absolute assurance that all numbers are right. And there's one area which is drawing attention is that a lot of auditing firms are providing on audit services like consulting and tax advisory. And these services may somewhat compromise the independence of audit firms and create conflict of interests. In some countries, audit preparation may be compulsory, say, in the year is every 20 years. Some of you may note that some audit reports have incorporated this so-called enhanced audit report with a section that comprises 3 elements: scope of the audit, materiality. Say, they may say that the audit scope will include everything, say, bigger than a dollar amount, and there may also be a so-called performance materiality. So, as presented, it's somewhat like a score given by auditor to the company's financial system. So, say a score like say 75% is somewhat considered satisfactory. There is also a section called key audit matters. Auditor liability. A lot of countries will have the audit firms incorporated as a limited liability partnership. But then, well, even it is constituted that way, in terms of their major audit failures, the individual members of an auditing firm can still face unlimited liability, although in practice, actual precedents are not so common because most cases were settled off the court. And lastly is internal audit. Well, it's part of a company, so it's a bit different from external audit. And the internal audit function reports to company executives, and usually there's a dotted line reporting to the audit committee of the board. And internal audit ensures that company's procedures and expected behaviors are delivered in practice. So pretty much checks that whatever written in the rules or company internal guidelines are actually followed. Right. We are getting to the end. Learning outcomes 5 and 6. And firstly, well, there are a lot of research pieces which indicate that out of the 3 ESG factors, environment, social, and governance, governance has the clearest link to financial performance. Well, though strictly speaking, that may vary from company to company, but then I'll say that except for, well, maybe certain companies extremely heavily exposed to environmental and social factors, for most have only say moderate impact or exposure to E and S, then governance is actually the clearest link to financial performance because it relates to how a company is managed. Some people may say that, oh, say private equity, because say the investors often have direct representation on the private equity investments board, which reduce governance risk. But then the reality is, because a lot of these private equity deals are high leverage, so margin of error is very small. So if there's governance failure, the impact can be a lot more damaging. Right, how should we integrate governance in the investment process? There are a few things that we can do. Threshold assessment. That should set minimum criterion on management quality. Risk assessment. to establish a level of confidence about future earnings, valuation range, or investment thesis. And in terms of valuation, we can allow for that. I mean negative covenants by a risk premium or a high discount rate. Like say if you use something like a discounted cash flow model. And alternatively, one may say that a company with weak governance can be an engagement investment opportunity if governance can be improved via active dialogue or proxy voting. So maybe there's opportunity to buy cheaply, and through engagement and governance improvement, then the earnings prospects will improve. Okay, finally, for sovereign debt, governance actually means the effectiveness of the government and robustness of the state and its institutions, the approach to the rule of law, and the general business environment. So, in terms of sovereign debt, the concern is about gaining assurance that the economy can prosper through good governance, so that sovereign debt obligations can continue to be covered. Thank you.